been at every DSDS, or if not every, almost every, certainly, without question. And this has grown to be the most important annual meeting in the world on sustainable development. And I think that process will only increase in future years because the topic of sustainable development is moving now to the center of the global agenda. It's hard to think about anything we want to do in the world, whether it's economic development and growth, energy systems, the food supply, and so forth, that now doesn't touch on the imperatives of sustainable development. And given the increasing instability in the Earth's systems, it's shaking everything in the world economy more and more. And with energy and food prices at very high levels, very high volatility, lots of uncertainties, I think it's inevitable that the Sustainable Development Agenda will become paramount, even though politicians don't know it necessarily. They don't necessarily know what's hitting them or hitting us. There have been, because of vested interest, lots of reasons to try to push this agenda to the side. I don't think it can be pushed anymore to the side. Asia, meaning India and China at the start, of course, will be at the center of this drama by the rapid growth of the economies, the central role of both India and China in technological change, the sheer size of the two populations, meaning almost 40% of the world's population. And so this meeting is essential. I'm delighted to be here, and I just marvel at Dr. Pachauri's leadership on building this from the start when it was not such a known topic anywhere in the world. And now with Rio Plus 20 coming just in a few months, the UN Global Sustainability Panel report being released here, which shows the central importance of this meeting, and with this agenda coming to the forefront, believe me, this will be the place to be each year. So I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you. Well, let me say it's not my leadership, it's the partnership that we have with Professor Sachs. He has been a supporter of this concept and this summit all the way through. And I think it's particularly relevant that we are holding this event and that it's getting increasing attention in India, because India has some critical choices. I mean, we can go in the direction of the rest of the developed world, and that would imply a huge resource intensity. It would imply issues that clearly impinge on security of energy supply, or we can take a path that, in a sense, sets a different course, which would have benefits not only for India but the global community. And we therefore believe that what we are doing is obviously of relevance to the whole of humanity. It's not just this country, but I believe, and as I've said in the opening session, that India really has to be in the lead in setting an agenda, creating a framework of sustainable development that not only is good for our people, but actually provides a beacon light for the rest of the world. So we're delighted that we have someone of Professor Sachs's distinction with us in this endeavor, and I think we can now open to questions and answers.
In Rio in 1992, 3 major treaties were adopted on climate change, on biological diversity, and on desertification. We arrive at Rio Plus 20 with the world already experiencing dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. That's the phrase that was used, that we were supposed to avoid. We didn't avoid it. We're 20 years later, we're in the middle of it already. we have not slowed the loss of biodiversity, it's accelerating. Major classes, amphibious species, pollinators, are under extraordinary threat, corals, and so forth. And in terms of desertification, we've just gone through the worst drought in modern history in the Horn of Africa, with millions of lives suffering and tens of thousands, at least, we don't know the count, dead as a result of this, especially children who die of disease because of immune systems that are undernourished, in essence. And there is a new drought in the Sahel, in Western Africa, that's taking hold right now. 3 treaties, 3, unfortunately, unmet aspirations. That's Rio plus 20. And the politicians would say, let's handle the financial crisis, because, first of all, the financial crisis is itself a reflection of their short-termism. The politicians don't think long-term. That's why they neglect the planet. That's why they neglect even the financial regulation. And some parts of the business community, especially the financial markets, play into that. And they form a symbiotic relationship of short-termism rather than focusing on the longer term. So don't believe the politicians if they say, we leave this till later. They're maybe representing what they think is their own interest for re-election, but they're not representing the interests of their constituencies, who are increasingly suffering by our societies not facing up to these challenges in a realistic way. This is a very serious problem. And that's why I said in my talk that I really think we need to move to practical goals, timetables, and agendas, and why I strongly support the notion of moving from the MDGs to the SDGs as the next step.
You see, quite apart from what has happened in the last 20 years, today we have enough knowledge. We have science which tells us that some of the things that are happening around the world are part of a pattern which science has clearly projected. Just to give you an indication of the kinds of extreme events and disasters that we're going to face in the future, the IPCC, as you know, 2 months ago brought out a special report on extreme events and disasters. A very sober, balanced assessment of what the observations are telling us and a projection of where we're going to end up. It's very clear that heat waves are on the increase. It's also clear that extreme precipitation events are on the increase, that precipitation patterns across the globe are changing, and it's entirely possible for us to take action by which, given all the lags and the inertia in the system, you perhaps might be able to correct the system and stabilize the Earth's climate in the next few decades. But if we delay it, then I'm afraid by the end of this century, as we have brought out, those heat waves which take place today once in 20 years will occur once in 2 years. Now, think of what that means to the poor, the infirm, the undernourished. You're really going to subject them to this exacerbation of existing stresses. And that, I think, is something we need to be concerned about.
That's a great question, by the way. And it's one of my big concerns about the current process, which is that it operates at a high legalistic level, but not at a practical level. In my 30 years of interactions with policymakers, they always want the same thing. They say, I'm very busy, what should I do? Because they're not interested so much in a seminar. They're not interested in going back to school. They're interested in your best advice, what to do. They're not interested in hearing that climate is changing, that the world is warming, that sustainable development is important, that there are big risks. They want to know, what should I do? What are you suggesting about next year's budget, about the next plan, about 5 years of public investment, about where to put the research dollars. This, I believe, is one of the shortcomings of the international climate negotiations right now. A lot of diplomats, and I also work with diplomats, so I'll be diplomatic. I like them. They're very good often at avoiding conflict, but they are not good at answering the question, what should I do? Because they're not technically expert. And so one of the things that I'm intent on doing more inside the UN system is helping to mobilize global expertise in a practical manner for not at a high level concept, but for countries and cities, what should they do in terms of moving the agenda along? And this is something that I'm looking forward to brainstorming as we do with Dr. Pachauri on this practical global network for action, how to move that forward.
But you know, I think often those who are in the business of carrying out analysis of policies don't pose these as practical options. And I think that's a skill which the intellectual community must acquire as quickly as possible. And I can say this certainly about the scientific community. You know, just to give you an example, if let's say a politician says, I want to do something about reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, we should be able to provide him with very clear options and costs and benefits. And I think if we were to do that, then these people can sell it to their constituents and tell them, look, what I'm doing is actually good for you. You know, in the case of climate change, I'll give you a figure. By 2030, we have estimated that we would have 6 gigatons of CO2 equivalent potential in reducing emissions, which can be achieved at negative costs. You know, there's just so many options. Look at the amount of waste we have in the system. So I would start with that, and I would pose that to the politician or the policymaker and say, look, these are the choices you have, pick on them.
Indian agriculture is not sustainable right now, especially because of the water crisis. In the bread baskets of India, the water table is dropping, and there isn't an adequate strategy right now. There are other parts of India that are plentiful in water but have not developed the agriculture adequately. And so there are many things to do, both to change the methods that are being used in the traditional Green Revolution sites of Punjab and Haryana and Gujarat and other places where the water table has been falling precipitously. There are other things to do to bring in new great agricultural production in the Northeast, in Assam and other states, and also in Bihar, Orissa, and other water plentiful places right now where perhaps flood control or new infrastructure investment needs to be put in place, or training of farmers on a large scale to make this happen. It involves many different aspects of systems, design, metering, pricing, incentive schemes, raising value added, renewing agricultural research, drought-resistant varieties, better seeds. It's a whole complex, but Indian agriculture, especially under pressures of climate change, is not sustainable in the current, in its current orientation.
Electricity prices are contributing to this falling of the water table. Excessive use of fertilizers and chemicals, which leach into the groundwater system, are causing serious disease, are causing very serious problems across the country. So I think that's another element of unsustainable agriculture that we have to come to grips with.
This is a very pertinent point with a lot of things to say. Some of these technologies, the green technologies, are cheaper than the current technologies, but they're impeded from spreading because of regulation, lack of knowledge, lack of effort, and so on. So it's not always true that they're more expensive. Dr. Pachauri mentioned that there could be some, quote, free or even payback savings on emissions by adopting better technologies. Sometimes the technologies are more expensive than market alternatives, but less expensive when you take into account the damage of the current approaches. So they are more expensive at a market price, but less expensive in terms of the total social cost, adding in the damage that comes from our current approach. When that's the circumstance, then you need some kind of correction to the market price. It could be a feed-in tariff subsidy for the greener technology so it can outcompete. It could be a tax on the cost polluting technology so it can't outcompete any longer. So I think you have to distinguish two kinds of circumstances. One is where the technology is better, cleaner, savings, more efficient, but it's not yet known or being used, or it's being blocked by a vested interest, or the uptake isn't there for some other reason, business as usual. The second is where you have to put the finger on the scale to make it so that the green technology really represents what it is, which is the lower cost overall technology when you include the social costs of dirty coal, for example. That also hasn't been done. This means that, broadly speaking, you need an incentive program that recognizes that moving to green is the society's best choice, but it won't happen by itself, simply by letting markets run rampant. They're too short-term. They don't reflect the interests of future generations. They don't handle the external costs, the damage that they do. And so these are the corrections that need to be made. But markets are very powerful. Vested interests are very powerful. That's why expert analysis that says, look, if you do this, here are the costs, here are the benefits, here's the practical timetable, that will help all over the world the governments to be more effective in this process.
Just two quick things. We really need focused research and development, because that's the only way we can bring down the cost, let's say, of photovoltaic cells or whatever. That requires, what are the options for that? Government funding, providing clear incentives and disincentives to ensure that the right kinds of research and development take place. And most importantly, in the context of climate change, a price on carbon. And I think if we were to do that, then consumers, producers, everyone would react to that signal and give you technologies, give you options which are low in CO2 emissions. So I think we really need these to be carefully evaluated.